Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today's session, the culturally situated design tools. We first found out about this program in probably 2011, 12, and Audrey Bennett was one of the co-PIs, and she came down, and I was telling them earlier I think that was my first pick up a celebrity presenter at the airport. So it was great to have her as an MFA and visual artist and visual communicator talking about this project. I think you'll see the connections are deep, and scope of the course, we're scaffolding things, talking about observing your neighborhoods and your communities and the cultures and what are your cultures. And this is just a great next step for really going deep with being culturally responsive to students and communities, as well as learning science, math, history, social studies, all those things. So we're thrilled today. We have Dr. 𝗶𝗶𝗹, who's an education and technology researcher working to bridge cultural concepts and practices with computing. He has worked on the CSDT project since 2010, is at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And Dr. Ron Eglash is a professor of School of Information at University of Michigan. He received a BS in cybernetics, his MS in systems engineering, and his PhD in history of consciousness, all from the University of California. His work as Fulbright Scholar was published in African Fractals, Modern Computing and Indigenous Design out of Rutgers, and featured in his 2007 TED Talk. His culturally situated design tool software offers math and computing education from indigenous and vernacular arts and features over 10,000 projects uploaded by students, teachers, and other researchers. As I said, we first brought this project to our summer institute. It was before it was even JOI in 2012. And I think this is the third or fourth year that Ron's been with us. So we're just thrilled to have him and Bill here today. So I'm going to step aside. We're always monitoring the chat. I would say keep your hands and feet within your chair area and enjoy the ride.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start with a little presentation. So some of you might have seen the documentary with Samuel Jackson on epics called Enslaved. And I've got a segment in episode 4 where we go to Ethiopia and we go to this 1,000-year-old church in Ethiopia. So there's a picture of the church, and you can see this interesting staircase here is not the 45-degree angle that you would expect, right? It's got this interesting curvature to it. So this is something they figured out mathematically 1,000 years ago. Pretty impressive mathematical heritage there in Africa. All right, so I wanted to start with a little epistemology. How do we know what we know? And there's certainly some wonderful examples of knowledge that's just social, just intuition, something like food. Which is the most delicious food? You're not going to be able to solve that question objectively, right? Everybody's going to have a different opinion about which food is the most delicious food. But there are other aspects of knowledge that are objective. So if I asked you about the relative density of these liquids in this little graduated cylinder here, you don't even need a human being in the room, right? Those things will just sort themselves out so that olive oil is at the top and vegetable oils below that, and so on. So we've got to start with at least 2 different categories of knowledge, some that's subjective and some that's objective. But then we've got these knowledge systems. So something like mathematics both has a history to it, which is social, And you have some sense that 2 + 2 = 4 no matter where you go, right? So I want to try to drill down a little bit into that sense that both of those things are at play in mathematics. And a great example of that is Euler's theorem for polyhedra. So Euler, the German mathematician, is looking at these geometric solids, right? Cubes and tetrahedrons and things. And he realizes that vertices minus edges plus faces always equals 2, no matter what shape it is that he's looking at. So he says, oh, I've got this great math discovery, and everybody's excited about it. And it works that way until 1815. And, there's always one smartass in the room, right? So Hessel comes along and he says, well, what if you took a cube, but you hollowed out a little room at the center of the cube? Now Euler's theorem doesn't work. So we can't have that as a law of mathematics. And this math fight breaks out. And so some of the mathematicians are siding with Hessel and saying, that's right, it's no longer a rule. And other mathematicians are siding with Euler and saying, well, come on, that's a stupid example. And interestingly, the pro-Euler faction wins out. And so they say, we're going to redefine what a polyhedron is. We're going to say it's the surface covering a geometric solid. So now we've excluded Hessel's counterexample. And that works pretty well until 1865. So just as the Civil War is breaking out in the United States, there's a civil war in mathematics. And Mobius, the guy who made the Mobius strip, Mobius says, what if you took two of these little pyramid looking things and we attach them by 1 point? And now it's only the surface, but Euler's theorem doesn't work. And this fight breaks out, and they side at the end, they side with Euler again. So if you look at the history of Euler's theorem, today we just say, oh, that was a discovery about the universal properties of geometric solids. But if you look at the history, you can see these interesting branch points where there could have been a mathematics that we don't have today. It would be a perfectly self-consistent mathematics. It would be just different than what you have if you assume Euler's theorem is correct, right? We would start defining things differently, and from there build up a whole body of theorems that would be counter to the way that we're using the term polyhedron today. It doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. They're just sort of different takes on the universe. And that's what it means to bring together both the social and objective sides of knowledge, is this understanding that it could be otherwise. I like to think of cultural evolution as having those branch points. So we don't have to fly to a different planet and investigate aliens to see what their mathematics looks like. We have these different knowledge systems here on Earth. Of course, they're somewhat entangled, right? It's not like there's clean separation. But you can at least get glimmers of what a different kind of science technology would have looked like. Let's first take a look at that European tradition. So this is a pin factory back in the 16th century. And making pins used to be a very difficult task. You'd have this wire, you'd have to cut the wire, you'd have to sharpen the end, and you'd have to solder a little head onto the other end. And it was a big deal creating these pins, but they're super useful and it's worth the time to do it. And then some pin factory folks started to de-skill. They said, I don't need to pay this guy a huge amount of money. I can just get a bunch of bums off the street. And if each of them does just one little unskilled task as a factory, that will produce even more pins, right? I've gained in efficiency and I don't have to pay people as much. And we call that de-skilling. So it's taking somebody who's a skilled craftsperson, breaking it up into a bunch of little tasks. And then you don't have to pay very much money. They can't go on strike. You've solved your wage problem. So this is happening in two directions. So on the one hand, economists like Adam Smith, this is from Wealth of Nations, economists are borrowing from science. So they'll see a word like efficiency or optimization, and they'll borrow that word from the sciences and they'll put it into economics. But physicists and engineers are, of course, hired by these factories to make these tools, right? And so they're borrowing things from economics and putting that back into science. So there's a kind of feedback loop going on. In fact, if you look at Charles Babbage, who created the first computer, you know, it's a mechanical computer that he had created and was never able to complete the design, but he at least drew it up. Here's what I would do if I could afford it. Babbage cites Adam Smith's pin factory. He says, what we need is an information factory of this sort. So even our information technology is built up on this system of extracting, you know, as much value as you can with as little payback as possible. And that's true not only for things like extracting value from workers, but also extracting value from nature and extracting value from social systems. So the whole of our science and technology is really built up through this tradition of trying to make science and technology serve the purposes of pulling out as much value as it can. And that's been a kind of a disaster. If you look at pollution, you're maximizing how much value you can suck out of nature, but that's creating deforestation and pollution and strip mining and all these huge social problems in the ecology. If you look at factories, you've got de-skilling, you've got assembly lines, you've got a whole history in which people's labor is devalued and people are doing mindless tasks that really are not fulfilling, right? And if you look at something like social media, you can see how information technology has more and more colonized our social networks and tried to pull as much value as it can out of our social lives. So in all of these cases, you've got this science technology that's built up around the idea of extracting as much value as possible and returning as little as possible. And it's just a formula for disaster. But there are other possibilities. There are other ways of doing science and technology other than this tradition of sucking things out. Now, when I was a student, I kept hearing about this great idea of Karl Marx that you would have everything owned by the state. But being a student in systems engineering, I started mapping out a little flow chart, and I realized, well, that's not really giving me an alternative. And in fact, if you look at wealth inequality in the Soviet Union or environmental pollution in the Soviet Union, it was just as bad as it was in the United States. If you have a giant extractive apparatus, whether it's owned by the state or owned by General Motors, doesn't matter. The pollution is going to kill you just as fast either way, right? When the boss yells at you, you know, you're revolutionary against the People's Republic, or the boss yells at you, you're going to get fired. What difference does it make if you're making low wages and it's terrible work? So it behooves us to look at other ways of being, right? Other ways of being in the world. And nature has some great examples of this. Nature doesn't extract and throw away a bunch of things. Nature always circulates. It works in these cycles. And you see that at every scale. You see that at the scale of biomolecules. You see that at the scale of organisms, right? The child becomes a parent who begets another child. You see that in ecosystems. So they undergo self-repair and self-organization. And Schrodinger, folks might remember Schrodinger's cat, same Schrodinger. He not only did the physics of subatomic particles, he also was one of the first physicists to investigate life. Yes, what is life doing that so mysteriously seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics? And he said, well, it's not really violating it. You're always losing more energy than you're gaining, but it is taking that energy and putting it in a cycle. And he called that negative entropy or negentropy. And this is the basis for how nature works, right? Is these self-organizing cyclic systems. But it's also the basis for a lot of indigenous cultures. And they have created an alternative form of science and technology. So if you're looking for a process that is self-organizing or cyclic or emergent, fractal geometry is a really nice place to start. Fractals give us a way of characterizing the kinds of geometry, the kinds of formations that we see in nature. It's not imposing a grid like Descartes does with Cartesian geometry, right? It's allowing the forms to emerge from the bottom up. And there's a very specific geometric quantitative process. It's not non-mathematical. It's just working from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So that was sort of my starting point with all this. I happened to notice that there were these fractal structures in African villages. So if you fly over a traditional African village in an airplane and you look down, you'll see circles of circles of circles, or rectangles within rectangles within rectangles. And my first take on it was not that this was an alternative knowledge system. I thought it was unconscious. I thought, well, coral reefs emerge from the bottom up, landscapes emerge from the bottom up. There must be some kind of unconscious social dynamics at work here that's creating these patterns. But as I started to look around at indigenous architectures, it was only the African examples that were fractal. And so that's when I realized, oh, there's something actually culturally specific. There's some kind of specific knowledge system that's involved here in making these. So as I started to accumulate these examples, I finally worked that into a Fulbright proposal, and the Fulbright folks funded me to spend a whole year just traveling around Africa, interviewing people and ask them about these fractal shapes. So once I started doing that, I started to realize it's not just the architecture. You go into one of these fractal architectures in Africa, circles of circles of circles, and you go into, in this case, we're looking at Burkina Faso. This is the woman's room called the Dago. And if you go in there into the Dago, you'll see these stacks of pots that reflect the larger scale architecture in that village. And there's a little stack of these gourds, these calabashes, that has a tiny little container, the 𝗏𝗶𝗶𝗹, where the woman keeps her soul. When she dies, they have a ceremony where they break all the calabashes, her soul goes off to eternity. And then when a child is born, that soul comes back again. So there's this beautiful symmetry in these scaling arrays that they're visualizing here. And I found that over and over again, that when I would ask folks, you know, sometimes people would say it's just intuition, but often if I dug around enough, I would find out that there was actually a very conscious kind of symbolization in these designs, whether it's textiles or sculpture or architecture. People could give me a meaning and a kind of algorithm, right? A recipe for how this is put together in that cyclic recursive way. And so the Ethiopian staircase that I showed you at the start there, this is in my book, African Fractals. You can see the church roof here has a cross within a cross within a cross, right? So it's this idea again of scaling shapes. And you get this sense that there's sort of this power emanating from this, right? That these are waves of spiritual energy broadcasting out. And then if you go to the church, you'll see this beautiful staircase. So when we were filming that television series, Enslaved, they flew me to Ethiopia, put on the cameras and said, okay, we filmed you talking about the fractal roof. Now we want you to go down inside the church and show us the fractals in there. And I said, well, I've never been there. How do you know there's fractals, right? So I said, well, you know, we want the audience to have a sense of surprise and discovery. So fortunately, we went down there. There was indeed this beautifully recursive structure here. So you can see we've got long steps and shorter steps and shorter steps and shorter steps. And as it's getting shorter and shorter in this dimension, it's getting longer and longer in the height dimension. So who knows what construction technique they used? You know, maybe they just bent some wood, right, and followed the curvature of that wood. However they modeled it, they just did a mathematically very precise job 1,000 years ago of carving this beautiful nonlinear scaling sequence into these steps. So really exciting opportunities for discovery that emerged once, you know, I just started seeing it through a different lens, right? That this very sophisticated form of science technology was there. It just didn't translate well into the way that I had learned it with proofs and theorems. That doesn't make it any less mathematical or computational. It's just a different way of going about it. And you can see from my intro where I'm trying to get at here is that one of the reasons you don't have that kind of breakdown, reductive breakdown, is because these are not extractive economies. These are generative economies where you're circulating value. You're not telling somebody you're going to be sitting in front of an assembly line all day long. Don't ask me what you're making. I don't even know, right? Instead, you have somebody working as a craftsperson, and the value of what they do is embedded in the material itself. So why would these indigenous cultures have a tradition where you're supposed to spend hours and hours and hours just crafting this beautiful complex shape in somebody's hair? That's what it means to have a generative economy. You're not worried about efficiency. In fact, the more you can violate efficiency and show the labor value that's embedded in an object, the better off you are, the more true you are, authentic you are to retaining those values. So it's a very different way of coming at mathematics and computing and science and technology. And of course, it didn't just stay there in Africa, right? Some of that tradition made it across the Middle Passage and made it to the United States. So when you look at something like Gee's Bends, this quilting tradition in Alabama, or you look at cornrow hairstyling today, or you look at some of the traditions in the arts in African-American communities, you can still see that fractal scaling. You can see that self-similar geometry at play. All right, so it's not just symbolic, right? It's a kind of geometric symbolism that's reflecting an underlying flow of value in the economy. And so the reason you've got cyclic pattern formation in the arts is because you have cyclic value flow in the ecosystem. So Bill and I have spent a lot of time in a little village in Ghana called 𝗬𝗏𝗄. And 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏, who unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago, Gabriel is here showing us how he gets bark from these trees, the body tree. And then they put the bark into these big vats, and they boil the bark all day long for a few days, actually. And eventually it boils down to this ink. And that's the ink that they're using to create these symbols called adinkra symbols. Then you take the strained bark, so all the pigment is now gone from the bark. You strain that out, and that goes into either nature through farming, or it goes into the sacred forest in the traditional villages. And the biodiversity in that sacred forest, so birds, monkeys, other organisms are going out to other areas that are not sacred, that are just areas where you're extracting things from, including things like tree bark. And so, yeah, you are harvesting bark from these trees, but you're doing that in a sustainable way. The bark grows back. And because you've set up this cyclic system, everything maintains a kind of metastability, right? So they're just spectacular, beautiful systems from a kind of engineering point of view, as well as from a point of view of arts and culture and mathematics. And so the challenge is then, how do we translate that into forms that are accessible to the students in our classrooms? So that's why we created that website of culturally situated design tools, was to try to get at some of these forms of value flow that are not alienating like they are in Western traditions, but are unalienated value flow, right? And I say Western traditions, but of course, if you look in Europe, it too has traditions that are folk traditions, that are survivals of earlier ways of life. And we try to keep those alive in arts and culture and so on. So it's not a binary either or. You can find unalienated value everywhere you look. You know, you walk into the kitchen in the morning and you say, you know, today I just feel like kind of taking my time and making one of those omelets that I know that's not very efficient, but I love these things, right? That's that moment where you're sort of grasping what it means to have unalienated value and kind of taking ownership of the process. All right, so part of the challenge is conveying that to students and showing them this huge variety of possibilities by which we can express unalienated forms of value. And for that purpose, we've got some of these heritage algorithms. We've got simulations where the students are going through the same process that you would do in a traditional society, but they're doing it on the screen instead of in the physical world. And within that computational medium, we can now much more easily sort of translate between the way that folks are thinking about it in the traditional heritage algorithm and the heritage algorithm that appears coded in software on the screen. Of course, translation is always an opportunity for mistranslation, right? And so anytime we sort of reduce things to, here's the algorithm, here's how to do it on the screen, you're kind of taking it out of that context and making it vulnerable. But you're also making it more fungible. You're making it more available for new things, for experimentation and innovation. We want students to have that sense that cultural heritage is not something that's frozen and locked away behind a glass case in a museum, right? It's something they can now take on and play with and engage creatively. So we want the students not just to be able to replicate the original, but to take these principles and play with them and be creative with them and do artistic practices or whatever they like. And we try to back that up. So we'll do things like controlled studies where one group has the culture-based software, the other group has some similar software without the cultural content. And we're able to show that the students find it much more interesting to approach it through these culturally situated design tools. So the National Science Foundation has been pretty generous with us. Nonetheless, I find it frustrating that when I give these presentations, often it's folks like the NSF program officers that just don't seem to get it. You know, no matter what I say, at the end of the day, they'll say something like, "Oh, I get it. So you're sugarcoating the lessons. You know, you're tricking the kids. The cheese of culture is going to tempt those little mice through the STEM pipeline." So I take pains in doing these presentations to try to make sure folks understand that is not what we're getting at, right? We're not trying to dupe the kids or trick the kids into learning. What we're trying to do is show them some different possibilities of coming at these sorts of relationships. Rob mentioned that Audrey Bennett, my co-PI, also my wife, shown here at the bottom of the screen, interviewing a quilter. Audrey's been with us on the project for quite some time, and it's just brought a tremendous amount of value to it through her expertise as a professor of arts and graphic design. So one of the things we do at the start is just make sure we have permission, right? We don't want to start copying somebody's work and simulating it without them saying, yeah, I'm on board with this. This is, you know, going to help our kids in our community or whatever it is. So we try to make sure we have that sense of cultural permission for whatever we do. And then we want to go through the kind of interview that you see Audrey doing here. So she's, you know, Carol's showing her one of her quilts, and she's got this, as you can see, there's this fantastic geometry going on here. But often the artists, when you ask them, what's the algorithm? They say, I don't know what the word algorithm means, or I know what it means, but it has nothing to do with what I do, right? They think of themselves as being purely intuitive. And sometimes that's just the end of the conversation. But often I find if we take the time to spend a day with the artists, eventually they'll come around to saying, okay, so I see what it is you're trying to get at. It's, I think, different for different communities. So for example, if we're working with Native American communities, often the conversation will start with, well, I want you to understand what the process of colonialism has been like for our people, right? They don't want me coming in all blustery with a big head. They want me to sort of come to a common understanding of what they've been up against for the last few centuries. And then sometimes they'll take me out to the forest. So if I'm in Africa or Native American community, they'll say, well, let me show you where the material comes from. And when I first started doing this, I would kind of roll my eyes and go, okay, yeah, sure, right, I'll play along. And then gradually over the last, I guess, decade or two, I've come to realize that's where a lot of the complexity lies. A lot of the sophistication is that relationship with the ecosystem, right? And the ability to figure out not just which species of tree, but where is that tree growing in relation to the water, in relation to previous harvests. I was interviewing a Native American artisan who was telling me about the different sides of the tree, the north side of the tree versus the south side of the tree having different properties. So they really get into the microstructure of that. In the case of Carol Harris here, she was showing us quilts that she makes in Detroit, but she showed us some pictures of repair in Detroit, how folks have been repairing their own houses for decades, and that she brings that sense of spontaneity that she sees in Detroit music. So techno and Motown and a lot of jazz all came from Detroit. So you can have that sense of place even in urban spaces, right? It doesn't have to be indigenous to have that sense of what it means to be an artist and a craftsperson and draw from these traditions. And then we try to translate those heritage algorithms into the tools that we're going to show you. And then we want to go through, once we have the tools, we want to be similarly very careful in how we present this to students. So we want to make sure that we start students with an understanding of what that cultural heritage is. Just because a student is African American doesn't mean they know anything about the history of cornrow braiding. Just because they're Native American doesn't mean they know anything about the history of beadwork and beadlooms. So making sure that they get that rich sense of historical background, making sure that it's presented in a way where we're telling them, look, this is a tradition that has a lot of math and computing concepts embedded in it. It's not necessarily the way we think of it in the math and computing classroom, but that doesn't mean those concepts aren't there. They're just presented in a different way, right? So getting the student to understand you're trying to translate between these different worlds, different worldviews. And then making sure that teachers have the flexibility to utilize this in ways that connect to the curriculum. We don't want to make you folks feel that this is something weird and exotic and can't just land on an ordinary everyday classroom lesson. And finally, embedding that in the community context. So thinking about how do we now feed that value back to where it was generated from, back to the community or the ecosystem. So one of the techniques we use is to enable a kind of hybridity, right? Students might start with an indigenous tradition, but then making available other kinds of images and sensibilities so the students can really make it their own and blend different cultural traditions together or just their own innovations. Often we'll talk about this as a kind of inverted funnel, right? A funnel that goes outwards instead of narrowing. So we'll start by simulating the original artifact, And then by helping the student be creative with that heritage algorithm, and then by physically rendering what they did on the screen. And then there's a fourth level of now bringing those physical renders back to the original community that it came from. So overall, we're trying to replace the old STEM pipeline. And I often remind folks that, yeah, you can do your diversity efforts on this end of the pipeline, right? We can make a more diverse STEM workforce, but that doesn't mean you're going to have a greater diversity of the things that come out of the STEM pipeline. You're still going to produce pesticides and bombs and extractive labor practices. And if that's the case, what's the point of diversifying, right? If it's just going to be things that are destructive to the communities that these kids are coming from. So we really want to have a generative pipeline, something that can feed back on itself, something that's delivering the fruits of science and technology labor back to those communities in the forms of new arts opportunities or new ecological opportunities, new entrepreneurial opportunities, whatever that is. Have that generative STEM loop. So here's an example of what we were doing where Bill is at over in Albany, New York. We started out with some interviews with folks in the braiding industry, cosmetologists who own their own braiding shop. We created the heritage algorithms for that, and we discovered the heritage algorithms for that, and then created the tools so that kids found that easy to use, right? So there wasn't a lot of work that went into creating these braiding patterns on the screen, something you could do that was just rewarding and made you feel like this would be fun to explore. And then we do some kind of physical rendering. So in this particular case, we used 3D printers to render these mannequin heads, and then brought those back to the braiding shops. And once we got the adult braiders talking about this, they got pretty excited. They said, yeah, we want to do more. And so they brought up the fact that pH balance for a lot of hair products is a huge problem. And so we started a little CSDT that's just about doing hair products. And we call that pH empowered. So here you have some students doing their pH empowered, bringing hair products from home and building little pH testers that plug into the computer. And then of course that value goes back to the braiding shops. In fact, one of the students who was involved with this has started her own line of hair products. So it's really neat seeing the value go back to these communities. Here's an example with the Anishinaabe community here in Michigan, in which we've done a similar kind of process. And we have a little paper where we talk about the fact that there are, within the Anishinaabe way of thinking about things, there are human agents, right, human collaborators, and there are non-human collaborators. So the wood people, the salmon people, right? So they're out there, you know, having their own effects upon the world as well. And so we've embedded some of that into the CSDTs that we'll show you. So here's that generative cycle where we start by interviewing elders and finding out how they built traditional structures, created some simulations based on that, had the kids do physical rendering. And then the kids said, well, you know, you could use this for like a greenhouse. And so we went back the next year and did a whole workshop around aquaponics and greenhouses. And so here you have that particular project being developed. And then we've brought that back to Native American communities. We work in Detroit with the American Indian Health and Family Services Group and have set up what we call the Trad Lab. So it's like a fab lab, but it's using tradition rather than using, focusing on digital fabrication. So lots of neat ways of bringing these things back to those communities, you know, keeping in mind, right, that you want to provide some opportunities for things to still have that feel of craft labor, something that's not being done for the sake of efficiency, but just the opposite, something where actually doing the task is the reward itself, intrinsically rewarding activities, whether that's a student in math class or somebody doing fabrication out in the community. So some of the applications we're been working on lately is using artificial intelligence to detect the difference between factory-made fakes and hand-woven cloths. This is called 𝗦𝗬𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃, and then putting it to work. So if you go to this website, africanfuturist.org, you can actually purchase some of these digitally fabricated clothing items from Ghana, or we've been sending the group there some technologies and working with them to develop the sort of entrepreneurial side of this. In fact, how am I doing on time here? 9:42. All right. So let me just give you one last glimpse here. Are you guys seeing that? Did I do screen sharing properly? Okay, great. So this is our website, africanfuturist.org. And so if you click on Afro-Future Fashions, you can see here's our CSDTs, here's the laser cutter they're using to cut that cloth, and then here's some of the items the students are selling. So a really neat way of seeing the stuff right in action in the communities. All right, before we go to the tools, let me ask if there's any questions. You can put it in chat, just unmute your mic.
Hi, Ron.
Kara, you had something here that you had written in chat, I see.
Do you mean me?
Yes.
My mind is just blown. Like I actually texted my sister, whose husband is a systems engineer, and I just said, this is like the marrying of math, science, and art in a way that my brain just is still processing.
Those are kind words. Thank you so much for saying that. Anybody else want to chime in, ask a question?
I'll ask a question. John Holland. I'm an art teacher in Richmond Public Schools in elementary school. And I was wondering if you could address how we can teach kids to see these patterns around themselves. Maybe from a philosophical viewpoint, but also from a practical viewpoint. And the idea that comes to mind is how you saw that those steps, which, like, when you first look at those steps, from a Western mindset, you don't necessarily see the curve. But as soon as you say the word fractals, and I do a lot with growing patterns with my kids in art, trying to get them, how can we get kids to see these sorts of generative patterns around themselves? Not only like in the physical, visual, but also in nature, in their interaction with nature. Thanks.
That's a great question. Let me dive into that right away, so I don't lose that thought. If folks can open up another tab on their browser and go to our website, csdt.org. And I'm gonna give folks a second to do that. And so are folks able to get there? Open up a tab to csdt.org. So the second item on there says cornrow curves. And if you click on cornrow curves, you'll see you've got a choice between two different grade levels. There's grades 3 to 5, and there's grades 6 to 12. So let's click on grades 3 to 5. And On the left side, you'll see a menu that has the cultural background, right? And so the way I would teach that in the classroom, there's 5 of these different cultural background sections. There's African origins, there's the Middle Passage, there's civil rights, there's hip hop, and then there's Afrofuturism. So if I was teaching that in a classroom, I would break the kids up into 5 groups. And I'd say, okay, you kids are going to be the African origins group. So I want you to go through that website, and then you're going to come back and report to us on what you found. You don't have to read it, just tell us what you thought was interesting that you saw there. And so the kids might have fun with this part of it. It's the little, identifying famous people with cornrows parts. Some of the kids really get into this little history game. So you have to drag the ancient hairstyle over to its match of a modern hairstyle. So some of the kids, very game oriented. So that's a fun little thing for them to do. So however the kids react to it, they bring that back to the group, right? And occasionally I'll run into a teacher who says, yeah, I didn't really have time for the culture part. So we just jump right into the software. And I always tell them, it would really help if you spent the time to do the culture part of it. Otherwise, what's the point? So we've got some tutorials set up, but often I find that with something like cornrows, it's so simple that teachers, once they've done the culture side, you can jump right into the software. So if you click on the software, you can see you've got a choice here between either a mathematics interface where you're just entering in numbers, so kind of parametric approach, and a programming interface. So I'm going to click on programming. And now I've got a little block-spaced program here. So when I click on this little green flag, you can see that little braid appear on the screen. And I'm going to give folks a second to catch up so that they can also click on the little flag and see the braid appear. Did anybody get lost? Should I show you guys how I got there again? So we started out with our csdt.org. We clicked on cornrows. We clicked on grades 3 to 5. We clicked on software. And we clicked on programming. And actually, if somebody can copy that URL and just throw it into chat, just to make sure that everybody's got access to that and we're all sort of on the same page, that would help. All right, so I'm going to assume that everybody is now on this page and they've been able to click on the green flag and see the little braid appear. So the next thing I want you to do is to change the number of times it repeats. So here's my little repeat loop and it says 20. So instead of 20, let's do 100. And now when we click on the green flag, we'll see that thing turns into a spiral. And that spiral curve is actually a really good match to that Ethiopian staircase. In fact, I believe I've got that here. Yep, there it is. So you can see there's the braid that we just generated, and there's that Ethiopian staircase. So when you look at organic things in nature, you'll see these patterns of growth, right? The curves of life, they're sometimes called. So it makes sense that as you're walking up to the church, you're walking towards the source of life, right? The power of life. And actually, I don't have a picture of it here, but right next to the staircase on the left side is a picture of the tree of life. And there's an duplicate circle on the other side of this pit. And when I looked over there inside the circle, I saw a human skeleton. No coffin or anything, just foot bones pointing out. So you've got this sense that the purpose of the church, right, is to facilitate that bridge between the power of life and what happens in rebirth. So really dramatic illustration of it there. Anyways, back to our software. So we've got this little braid here, but it's shrinking down really fast. And we don't want it to shrink down quite that fast. So we'll go to the scaling factor that currently says 93, and we're going to increase that to 99. So it doesn't scale down very fast. Each little plat is only 99% of the one that came before it. And you can see that's starting to form this spiral, but 100 wasn't enough. We've run out of plats. And so I'm going to turn that repeat loop to 200. And now I can see it really, shrinks down and down and down and down and down. So John, I know that's a long answer to a short question, but I find that feedback loop of experimentation is so much more powerful than hours and hours and hours of a talking head lecture. That really comprehension is facilitated when you're connecting the eye and the mind and the hand, and you've got that experimentation loop happening. And if you can get the kids playing around with these things in the classroom and doing these little sort of art investigations of it, you've really put yourself in a good place. So for example, here I could take my little color block and I could put my color block out there. And I've set color to be proportionate to the size of the plat. So the smaller it goes down, the farther down the color spectrum I go. And I've multiplied the size by 1.5 to do that. So if I use a slightly bigger number, now I start farther up the spectrum towards the blue end of the spectrum. So lots of neat ways to just experiment around with this. I can replicate this, duplicate it, reset the size, reset the angle, and now I'm laying down. Let me make those both 20 so it won't take too long to do. Now I'm laying down two braids on top of each other. So if I wanted to, I could then start to mess around with it, right? So I could shrink one braid down faster than the other braid is shrinking down. And maybe I want to make a whole series of those, right? So I could put that inside of a recursive loop. So once the kids start playing around with this, there's just a huge number of possibilities that come up. All right, so I wanted to make sure we had a second to just take a quick little tour through the CSDTs, because in the next phase of this, you folks are going to be picking out what tool you want to investigate. So that was the cornrows tool, and we have that differentiated for grades, elementary school versus high school. Most of them are just pan grade K through 12, probably a little too sophisticated for the young kids and maybe not sophisticated enough for the old kids, but it's a pretty good medium. So for something like quilting, rather than diving into just one culture, we're looking at quilting across many cultures. And so if you've got a classroom where you have lots of different, a lot of ethnic heterogeneity, that's often a great choice to start with. So here we've got something like G's Bends. And so we've got some little apps here where the kids can look at African musical rhythms and see how that reflects visual rhythms in the quilts. The Appalachian culture here is included in part just because those are awesome quilts, but also because I wanted to make sure that white kids don't feel like this is sort of, you know, targeting them as the enemy, right? And so Appalachian culture is mostly white, but if you look at the history of Appalachian quilts, the ones that were done back before the Civil War, you can see this pattern called the radical rose, and that was a symbol of the abolitionist movement. So low-income white folks in the Appalachian region, a lot of them sided with the North before the Civil War. They realized they had something in common with Black citizens. Of course, after the Civil War, all of that changed, right? But it's interesting asking the students what would have changed. How do you go from you know, that pro-abolitionist culture to the culture that you find in those regions today? But giving the kids a sense that whiteness is also something that's worth studying and has these beautiful liberating histories embedded in it. Here's the Lakota, one of the 7 Sioux tribes. In our area up here in the Northeast, huge number of Anishinaabe Native nations. And then when we talked to math teachers, they kept saying, well, the really valuable part of this for me is reflection symmetry, right? And so we realized we really need to focus on these 4 directions quilts. And so we've accumulated examples of those. Here's the Iroquois 4 directions quilts. Iroquois 4 directions quilts. You can see the root of the pine tree is supposed to be aligned with the 4 directions, right? This is a Asian group, the Hmong. And each one of these has that little background story, as I was telling, in relation to the Appalachian region, where we've tried to look at how that particular cultural group has expressed its interest in social justice. So in the Appalachian case, it was this connection to the abolitionist movement. In the Hmong case, it was the fact that during the Vietnam War, they sided with the US. And so when Vietnam fell, we brought a lot of Hmong folks to the US, but in doing so, we tried to enforce this assimilationist perspective. And so needlepoint was one of the few things where they could, you know, still make money. And so there was a kind of blossoming of that tradition for the Hmong in the US. This is another attempt at helping kids sort of rethink white identity. So one way of doing it was looking at the Appalachian region. In the case of the Celtic religion, we point out the fact that these were basically the indigenous tribes of Europe, right? At one point, the Celts weren't just in Ireland, they were spread all the way across Europe, all the way to Turkey. And it was very much an ecologically sustaining, you know, pantheist religion. But they got invaded and colonized, just like other indigenous groups around the world. The only difference is that the colonizers in the case of Europe were other Europeans. So you had the Roman army marching in and colonizing these little Celtic tribes, and then you had Christianity spreading and sort of converging with, you know, the Protestant work ethic and so on. So it gives kids a chance to sort of rethink white heritage as having these other interesting perspectives on it. And then the last one we did was Afrofuturism. You don't want kids feeling like cultural identity all lies in the past, right? And so if you look at folks like Native American scholar Grace Dillon, or you look at the Afrofuturist authors in science fiction and now in, you know, textiles and movies and everywhere else, there's this wonderful sense that we can think about heritage lying as much in the future as it does in the past. So Sally Kane kindly gave us permission to show some of her designs and where she gets those from. So they're inspired by these biomorphic connections in nature, as well as African cultural traditions. And then a bit here about the Black Panther movie and how Ruth Carter adopted some of those traditions. And we have another one of our fun little games where you're trying to connect the African tradition with the costume that Ruth Carter created for it. All right, so that is the quilting tool. There's the cornrows tool. Let's see, we put bead looms on the list here just because it's such a great connection for math teachers. You're immediately in that Cartesian coordinate system, and whether you're doing that using the math approach, so you're just doing parametric values, or you're doing it with the programming approach, so that you can sort of keep track of this algorithm as you created it, and try swapping in different structures. So here I'm going to throw in a right triangle and I'll color it red. So now I've got the same design, but I've thrown a red white triangle in there. So different ways of utilizing those tools and connecting it to the curriculum. Let's see here. For yarn fans, crochet fans, we've got yarn arts. That's another one where you're going across many different cultures, and instead of focusing, drilling down into one particular cultural tradition. And also some really nice connections here with community activism. So who's been taking up things like yarn bombing, where you're using crochet as a protest against Wall Street in this particular case. Let's see here. We've got kente cloth. The henna tradition actually came out of a request, local request. And we're certainly interested in your ideas about what you would want to see added to the repertoire of tools here. So in this particular case, there was a librarian in Michigan who said, I've got huge numbers of students from families with a Middle Eastern heritage that are coming into our library, and some of them are trying to reclaim that heritage or just looking for something that connects in some interesting way. Can you guys come up with a tool that would be attractive to them? So I had done some speaking tours in India and was interviewing some of the folks that do this henna patterning. And so we decided to dive into that. So here we've got North Africa and the Middle East. So you can see the hand of Fatima there. There's a very different tradition in West Africa using the same plant, right? So it's a plant that leaves this not a permanent mark, but it lasts for many weeks on your skin. But the way they do it is with a negative. So they're actually creating the pattern in tape and then putting your hand in there, pulling it out, and then pulling the tape off. And then in India, you've got these beautiful curves based on things like the mango, these arcs and curves. And so there's a whole nother tradition coming from there. So in the software, you've got your choice between imitating radial patterns or imitating vines or imitating dots and curves, whatever you think the kids will respond to the best, or you could just leave the option up to the kids. Let them decide which one they're going to do. So that was henna. We've got some wonderful examples here with graffiti, adinkra. These, if you go into these barber shops, they've got these really fantastic sets of imaginative geometric designs in barber shops. And so thinking about how you would encounter those kinds of designs. So here's one of our Detroit barber shops where you can see just spectacular variety in the way they've done that. So those are continuous curves. So you've got your little blocks that say, give me a logarithmic spiral, or give me a circle. And then we've got some 3D applications here And then finally our African fractals. And so John, this also speaks to the question you were just asking. So how do I help kids develop that sensibility of what it means to be working with scaling shapes? So one way to do that is to do something like the Koch curve, right? So here I can enter into edit mode. Got that looking a little bit large for some reason. Shrink that down a bit. So if I go into edit mode, I've lost my numbers on the screen. And I can go through each separate iteration. And then I can go back and say, well, what if I wanted to mess around with that? So let me change that curve a little bit. I'll put a little asymmetry to it. And now when I try it, you can see that asymmetry is reflected at every scale, right? So that's the mathy version of it. It's just getting across the concept of iteration and recursion and how to think about fractals in that sense. And then we can do the same thing here with plants. So you can take something very simple like this little curve. So if we look at the seed shape for that, I can mess around with that a little bit. And then you can start to see how the African designs are reflecting that sensibility. So in the case of something like the 𝗬𝗲𝗃 village here, you can see I've got individual house here with the sacred altar towards the back, the house of houses, the corral with the human habitation towards the back, and then the village as a whole here. And here's the chief's extended family and the chief's immediate family. And then there's a little ring for the spirit people, right? And of course they have ancestors, so they have a ring within the ring. It's rings all the way down. So again, you want kids to get some practice with using this in a kind of iterative loop where you're editing and trying it out and then going back and re-editing. All right, so I think we are at our time now for folks to choose. Is that right? Stacy, Rob, you guys keeping track of this better than I am?
Well, yes, I think maybe that would be, we're a few minutes behind. So I can launch this poll, and that has all of, it looks like 2 different questions, but only because we don't have enough room in the first question. But there are 13 options for you to choose. And so I'll just launch it right now. And if everyone will just take a moment to pick the group that you would like to explore, then we will create some breakout groups based on the top 3 or 4 choices.
Tiana asked about the Black Panther matching game. That was in cornrows. And come to think of it, we have the same matching game in quilting in the Afrofuturist quilting section. Technically, they're not quilts, they're costumes, but they're piecing together pieces of fabric, and it looks so cool. I thought, let's throw that in too. So your mission in these breakout rooms is just to explore, to explore the cultural background, explore what sorts of designs you can create with it, to collaborate with each other, thinking about how you might use this in the classroom. If you click on teaching materials, we've got some of the examples of using laser cutters and 3D printers and just hand crafting fabrics So how you might want kids to be doing sort of hands-on physical renderings of their virtual designs. So it's an opportunity for you guys to just have a sort of open-ended exploration of this. We want to make sure that folks don't lose their work. And Stacy, do we have a folder or something where they can store the images?
We can create that for sure. Yep. McKenna?
Let's use the Google folder, the slide. So we can just use that link. So we have a Google presentation for any of your work. Just use one slide and it's already built. So you just take and drop any images you want on that, or links to things. So.
So as you're just exploring and messing around, you want to think about, how am I going to let other folks know about what we've been doing? And so that's where the slide part of this comes in. I don't know that I actually showed people how to save their work. Up here, you can create a username and store it to the cloud. But you can also just download it to your hard drive. So if I'm in something like the programming software here, and I say, gosh, that's a really great design, I want to make sure I save that. If I am logged into the system, you've created a user account for yourself and you're logged in, then you can say save as, and it'll save to the cloud. You just name it whatever you want and save it. If you don't want to bother with all of that, that's okay. You can just save it to your hard drive. So again, I would go up here to this little file menu, and I would say export the project. And then it would download to my hard drive. And then if I want to import it, something that I've saved, I say import, and that's the thing that I just imported or exported. So that's how you would do saving. You can also just do a screen capture. So if I had some design I was creating, I can just right click on that and select pick, and that'll save a picture of what's on the screen to the hard drive. So that's another way to do it. Any questions about what folks will be doing in the breakout rooms? And of course, Bill and I will be waiting out here, and so folks can always ask us to join a breakout room.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when we get into the breakout rooms, we're going to be working on the activity, but we're going to also post our work on the Google slide.
Rob, Stacy, can you help envision how that will work?
So if you don't get finished with what you're doing, you can keep on working on it after we're done today, and then post it. So it's not like you have to post it immediately. But
so this would be our homework for the week, or is this going to be a separate submission?
Exactly.
Oh,
So
okay, okay.
If you feel like you got something good by the end of today, that's fine.
Oh, I do. Oh, I do.
Nice.
Oh, I do, Bob.
But if you want to keep playing with it, or you decide once you get into one room, you know what, I don't like that one, I want to switch over to another one.
Okay.
Everybody is certainly welcome to keep on playing with it after our session today.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just a way to share. You know how people like to make and share their work. So let's take while we're setting up these rooms, and before we get everybody in there, like this will be your time to take a break, I think.
It's like, I don't know how to use a graph anymore.
Yeah,
I
my
was
skate.
struggling.
Tiana, I was thinking the same thing. Like graph, what? X, Y, Z, minus, plus.
I don't do,
down.
listen, I teach preschool now. And even prior to that, K through 5, we were plotting dots on a coordinate graph. Okay, but this is different. Yeah, my
Well,
skater is doing something special.
I found the infinity button and my guy's still falling. So
Well, I've got the lines I like. I just want that straight line so I can end and tape it and flop it in the thing and be done.
So I find it useful to go through those sample equations.
That's what I'm using. And then I'm
Yeah.
altering. But that's the problem. When I get ready, I'm trying to move it to a certain spot and it's all the way over here. And then when I do a negative, it's a fit like it. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, I think Bill, are you taking notes here? So
Yes.
so we need something like a frequently asked questions on Skateboarder.
The frequently asked questions on graphs. Great day. Because
Well, it's y-axis.
okay.
All right, so do we have everyone back now? Are we ready to present?
Oh, I do get it. Bob. Thank you, Bob. That's what I need. It's y-axis. I need to change to the x-axis, right? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Okay, we go see. Okay, I'm a mute. I'm sorry.
We've got everyone back from the break rooms now. Okay, so let's see. First up is graffiti. So can the graffiti folks show us your slides or just tell us what sorts of process you went through? That's Andrew and Annie and Shannon.
This is Shannon. I can say I don't have something to share. I was still trying to figure it out and work with it. The way my mind works, I was having a little bit of trouble with it. So I'm hoping to continue to use some time this afternoon to get into it a little bit more to understand it.
Sounds good. And I see a little note from Annie saying nothing completed yet, but it's the journey and not the destination. John, did you get a chance to look at the graffiti site? You're muted, John.
I'm sorry, my computer locked up. It's a work computer. What did you say?
Oh, I was just wondering if we're having folks who are in the graffiti group report back. So
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'm usually pretty quick with technology type stuff. I have used a program with my elementary students that talked about branches and angles and things like that to make designs, but I was just really having trouble between translating visuals and I know the history of graffiti, so like that's and I've received a grant to study it.
Wow.
With the Community Foundation. So I was really excited about it, but just the interface was just it was definitely not for my elementary students. And I had a really hard time working with it too. I was trying to generate some shapes that had some dimension to them. And to go sort of like work off of that idea of the grid shape and the twisting of the surfaces. And I couldn't do anything with it. I really couldn't do anything with it.
Let me take just a second Bill, you were in that group as well?
Yes, and I have to say that I may have hijacked some of it into Adinkra because we use the graffiti tutorial is made up of, there are links to Adinkra.
Right. Yeah, I was just telling someone that if they wanted to look at the barbershop, it's the same thing as well. So you start out positioning your can somewhere, and then you want to draw something. So I'll just draw a line. And so I've got a line here that's moving down from right to left, and I'm not terribly happy about that going off the screen. You'll notice that where you put your mouse, there's a little readout down here that tells you where you are on the screen. So I know that I want to be maybe up here at 0, 0. So I'll just put in 0, 0 as my starting place. And now I'm thinking, well, that looks a little bit like the start of a letter A. It's kind of expanding a little more quickly than I want it to. So let me give it a lower rate of pen growth. And if I'm going to draw a letter A, I'm going to need a little more room. So let me start it, say, up there. According to my readout down here, that would be about x equals negative 150, y equals 100. So I'll say x equals negative 150, y equals 100. So now I've got my A going that way. And I want to get another A going in the other direction. So let me go over here and I'll duplicate that. But before I do, you notice I didn't start it with any particular angle. I just let it go at whatever angle it happens to be at. And I want to be a little bit more deliberate about that. So I'll tell it to point at a particular angle. And I'm thinking that angle is something like, I don't know, 270. That's a little bit more than I wanted. 220, something like that. Yeah, there we go. I mess around a little bit here, get the angle the way I want. And so now I've got a pretty good first leg for the letter A, right? And now I can just repeat that again. So I can go up here and duplicate it. But this time I want the angle to come out in the other direction. Let's see here. I go up to the same point, but I rotate that by 180. Let's see if I manage to reflect that. That's pretty close to where I want it. So just by trial and error, I can get it more or less the way I want to make the first couple of legs of my A. And then I might want to switch over to a different color. And I'll just run through the whole thing again. Only this time I'm going to do it with green, and I'll just offset it by a little bit. So instead of doing negative 150, I'll say negative 140. Oops, that was the original. So the red is negative 150. Once I switch to green, I'll switch it to negative 140. And now I lay down the red first, and then I lay down the green. And now I've got that, sort of dimensional effect as if it's in 3D. So just, running one by one, trial and error, I find is the best way to go about these things. All right, that was the graffiti group. And who do we have next up is skateboarding. Anybody want to volunteer for skateboarding?
I'll volunteer. So skateboarding is fun, but it's challenging if you're not that familiar with the whole X-axis, Y-axis thing. I did just learn that you can reposition your skateboarder as to where he can start, which might make it easier to understand. But the sample equations are helpful because you can just adjust the X start and X end. I had 2 lines going. I was trying to get that third one in, and it's a struggle. And then your skateboarder just falls and falls and falls. But it's kind of fun. I could see where kids could really get into it. If it was a little more simplified, or there were perhaps directions to say, if you do this, then this. This is more of a play around and see what happens to your skateboarder.
Yeah, we really need a tutorial for that. And we do have a tutorial for most of the tools, but haven't created one for skateboarding yet. It really came out of a request from some math teachers saying, I get what you guys are doing with computing education and with elementary school education, but I'm teaching algebra. And so I need something that is really, getting at the experience of doing algebraic equations. And so I was watching my kids play with line writer, where you draw on the screen and it goes down the lines. And I thought, well, if we could do that with equations, then we're good. But yeah, we definitely need to get around to doing a tutorial for that one. Anybody else want to say anything about skateboarding?
Can we see a graphic at all?
Oh, sure. Did you guys save any of your work?
I think most of us were just still playing around with it and figuring out how to use the tools. We definitely got into a really good discussion, though, about applying, like, when you have a kid who comes to this kind of equation, if they have the language of skateboarding, being able to hook them into understanding graphing better than if they didn't have that language, because you can, for a skateboarder or a kid who builds ramps, you can take this application back out kind of into the real world and then have that dual language. So it's definitely a good way to get some kids hooked into understanding algebra better than maybe just sitting down and here's what it does. Here's this graph, let's plot this line. It gives them a real world tool.
Yeah, so we really wanted to respond to teachers that were trying to do something mathematically specific, like slope, for example. And so just teaching the kids how to do the y equals mx plus b form of the equation and understand the role of slope in that equation. So here's that skateboarder. Now I want to change it up, and so I could do something. I could change the sign on this, for example, to be positive, and then draw a new one here. So now I've got a second one. If you redraw, it changes the old one. If you hit draw, it adds a new line to it. So now I've got the first slope that I did that was negative, right, is going down. And then the second one I did that's positive is going up. And so now I can find out what my skateboarder does when the two of those meet. So it comes down here, hits the intersection, and then goes back up. And so we've got a joy versus ouch here. Joy is when you go fast. And so you can sort of challenge yourself, how can I get my skateboarder going fast without dropping 500 feet? is one way to go about using it. And of course, lots of different ways for the kids to add in these equations. So it could be something like a parabola. And so now, let me start my skateboarder up here.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, fire away.
Have you gotten any feedback from the teachers into the effectiveness of the program? I mean, have they shared with you? Because that was one of our questions, and we had a great discussion about it. Have you gotten any feedback in terms of, has this helped children understand these really abstract equations?
So we've only had the one teacher we started with who was using it to teach slope. And she was really excited about it. She said, just, negative slope versus positive slope, like I was just showing you, that gets much more ingrained if the kids sort of see it performed on the screen. But I haven't yet had a teacher say, I'm going to adopt this for our algebra class on parabolic curves or something. So that would be really lovely to see if somebody wants to take that on.
Thanks.
Maybe we can recruit some math teachers, some high school math teachers, or middle and high school math teachers to do some experimentation.
Yeah, and I think that's why we never got around to a tutorial. I just wasn't sure where teachers wanted to take this material. But now that I'm hearing all this interest that I didn't realize was there, we could definitely create a tutorial that's just based on something simple like drawing lines and slope. All right, let's see, we did graffiti and skateboarding. Ryan, how was African fractals?
So I had somebody else in there with me for a little bit, but then she had to go. And so I started reading through the African fractals, and then I was curious and I wanted to read through some of the other options that were on the website. And my plan was to then loop back around and play with making the tree fractal. I really wanted to do that one. I haven't gotten to that yet because I got really excited and interested in the 𝗦𝗬𝗀𝗃 section and wanted to read everything about that. And then I was like, well, maybe I want to do this because this is really cool. Anyway, that's where I was at.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. Yeah, there are these really interesting connections if you can get outside of the tendency for our curricula to put everything in these separate little boxes, right? So as you start to investigate the 𝗦𝗬𝗀𝗃, you start to realize a lot of those are logarithmic curves, which we now know we're seeing in the cornrow braiding. And so cornrow braiding is approaching a logarithmic curve as a discrete entity, right? So you put in a stamp in a plat, you move it over, you change the size, stamp in the plat. You do that over and over again as a discrete sequence. But with the 𝗦𝗃𝗃 tool, you're doing it as a continuous sequence. And so you can get these power law scaling effects from all sorts of different processes. And that's a lot of what scientists have been saying about why we keep seeing fractals over and over again in nature, is that the kinds of cyclic process that nature uses, whether it's biological evolution or even something like a geological cycle, naturally tends to produce these logarithmic scaling patterns. Let's see here. Well, we're almost out of time. So let's jump to Navajo Weaver. And that's Amy and Brooke and Kara and Paige.
So
Now, Paige, did you get something completed?
yeah, so I actually was sitting here kind of completing, and I saved it on the cloud. So if you want to, it's under Bead Project V page.
How do we get to that? Anybody?
I don't know.
So there should be a URL that you've created for it. So it's project number 23 something something something.
I got you. And then
I took a screenshot of mine.
Great.
there.
Can they share their screen, Stacy?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you'll be
Let's
able
see
to do
here.
that.
Oh yeah, I can. I got you.
Wow.
So then I realized as I was doing just like points that then appear in the bead patterns, you can create like lines and rectangles and triangles and linear, you know, all of that stuff. Again, like refreshing my mind on the X and the Y's, minuses and all that stuff. Then the other thing too was if you see down here, the blues are different. It's just if you're going to use one color, use it in the same spot the whole time instead of trying to switch back and forth. That was kind of a learning curve. So if you had the grid, then that's kind of like what it's starting to look like. So now like I look at it and I'm thinking this middle should be red and not yellow. Maybe, I don't know. But that's my little creation. I found this a lot easier than using the other option that's offered. Because that to me is just like way too much math and figuring it out and everything. But this is, I feel, would be easier for students. Yeah.
Anybody else want to share their screen in that group?
I can try. And I pretty much feel like I don't know what I'm doing with sharing. Can you guys see that?
Yeah. You've been busy.
Paige is clapping her hands because she knows it was such a struggle for me. I want to share though, if I can, the very first thing I did was I kind of, and I'm the one who has 3 Native American Cherokee tribe Indian children. And I went to, there's a video, YouTube video, if anybody's interested or if anyone has any Native American children in their classes, there's a video there of a student at a university in New York, I believe, who is a member of the Chippewa tribe, who was doing a Cartesian representation on the floor of how she creates a quilt. And it was kind of cool. It was only like 2 minutes long. So that's where I started. But this one, I wasn't as fancy as Paige and I couldn't take the background off, but this is my screenshot. I thought it was interesting because I literally had no idea what I was doing. I just clicked until something showed up, which is I'm sure what our kids do. And I think they actually are better at that than we are. Like intuitively, they were just like, oh, let's just do this. And we're like, wait, we don't know what we're doing. So and I thought, oh, that's how interesting that I just clicked some numbers and now I'm calling it man running because it kind of looks like, you know, a man running. So, and it's towards something. Don't know what it is, but yeah, thanks.
I was going to call it birthday cake shooting laser beams.
That works too.
that seemed obvious to me. Of course, that's what she's going for. Yeah.
So that part of the creative side I had such fun with, but the mathematical side, yep, wanted to cry. I was kind of with Tiana there for a minute. I was like, yeah, graphs, what? Yeah. But yeah, so there you go. Thanks. This was very interesting for me.
Could I jump in?
Please, yeah.
I was just thinking about what you said about that circular connection, and I noticed as you said that, I mean, I'm just thinking about the old, I am old enough to remember the Atari where the tennis, it was the ball back and forth, so it wasn't itself circular, and this reminds me of that idea of that circular, and I'm not using the right language, but what you described about the difference in the stem, I feel like that visual really creates that because the ball is going out, but it's going to come back. So it's not going to, there's not going to be a waste, that it's going to be continually rejuvenated and continually within the system. That makes sense.
That's the best interpretation of Atari I've ever heard. Yeah, I love that.
I remember
Thank
that
you. That's really old. I just can remember it was back and forth.
All right. Well, I think that's all of our groups. Did anybody want to add anything else? Other questions, comments? Am I missing something in chat here?
No, I think everybody just enjoyed it.
Okay, good, wonderful, wonderful, fantastic. Folks are welcome to contact me. It's eglash@umich.edu. If you want to do a little follow-up conversation, or you have questions about implementation or anything else. And otherwise, I will thank you very much. A wonderful experience for us to get this sort of feedback folks are putting out. I now know that there's all this interest in skateboarding that I didn't realize was out there. So really good stuff to help inspire us. Thanks, everyone.
Well, let's give Ron the big skateboard. Thank you. And Bill, thank you both for being here. This is, mind-blowing work, and all the connections. I hope you guys are really starting to see these different lenses as we look at things. And it really struck me as kind of the chatter around intuition and seeing these things. And I don't think it's intuition. I think it's learned. I think, these our ancestors and all these ancient people, they're observing and they're learning experientially, and they're processing, they're doing, but they're doing it at such a deep and detailed level that they're not naming it. And I feel like our work with integrating all these practices, creative arts, whatever you want to call it, and community, so it's bringing these expertise together, and it's naming your expertise as educators. So think about all the things that you're doing in the classroom intuitively. Those are things that you've learned and skills you've developed. So we're asking you to name those, and then we're asking our visiting artists and experts to name what they're doing intuitively. So when Hamilton Glass or the sound, the DJ guys next week, they're going to talk about sampling and bringing things together and the choices they make in their process. And we're asking them to name that expertise. And I think, laying cornrows over the stairs so we can see those algorithms and understand that. And I love the part where you're talking about, Audrey talking to the woman with the quilts, and, it sounds like she went that process of, I don't know what algorithms are, but by the end, oh yes, that's what we're doing. So I think that is the work, and real appreciative that Ron and Bill and you guys are bringing this to the forefront. But that's the work that we're asking you guys to do, is naming your expertise. We're going to have other experts name theirs, and then that gives the kids the opportunity in the classroom to really contextualize the curricular content. And that was a part of the skateboarding, was these skaters can contextualize all these principles of math and physics in a way that's concrete, and then we can name, well, here's the math and physics that you're doing, and that's what makes it stick. So again, really appreciative to have these people that are a lot smarter than I am doing all this work.
Come on.
And so we do have an exit ticket, and the last question on the ticket, so it's feedback for the session that we'll share with Ron, and then any questions, curiosities, or things that you have for tomorrow. We're going to do, Bob and I will be just doing just a check-in. We'll probably talk for 10 or 15 minutes. There's just some things we want to see if you are able to make connections and what you've been working on and what you're thinking about. So it's a really informal piece. We'll go over the Acme chart just a little bit, but if you have things that you want to discuss or want us to talk about, throw that in the exit ticket as well. So any final questions for our culturally situated design tool team from around the country? Once again, Ron, Bill, thank you guys for being here. It's really powerful stuff.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure, yes.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, William.
Yes.